about urban ecology, and in particular the urban ecology in the city of Cape Town. And I'm going to be looking at trends, global trends, African trends, and then trends in the city of Cape Town. I'm going to look a little bit at legacies, land use legacies that we live with, and then end off with some imperatives in how we should be moving forward. Currently, 50% of the world's population live in cities. It's not evenly spread across cities. It's quite skewed between developed and industrialized regions. Developing and industrialized regions. And in the more developed parts of the world, the figure is around 80%. We know at the moment that we're currently experiencing a massive growth in urban settlement, in urban areas around the world. And it's estimated that by 2050, 5 billion people will be living in cities. This figure here shows that really where this phenomenal growth is happening is in the developing regions. So on this graph, we can see millions of people being added to our global urban populations through time, and we can see really this is happening in the developing regions of the world. Africa has the dubious honor of being currently the fastest growing urban population in the world. We are hurtling along. Our cities are growing phenomenally fast. In the year 2000, 300 million people in Africa lived in cities, and it's estimated that by 2030, which is just around the corner, there will be 750 million people in Africa living in cities, which is a phenomenal figure to get your head around. If you just stop and think, particularly around 2030, which is just around the corner. So we really are, we're rapidly urbanizing. In fact, Malawi, I think, at the moment, is the fastest urbanizing country on the planet. What makes African urbanism different? Are we doing it in the same way that other countries around the world have urbanized? With close scrutiny, there's some recent work coming out at the moment that suggests there are some things that are different to urbanization in Africa. Firstly, we're a very arid continent, which is something that's important in terms of supplying large amounts of water to cities. It has significant ecological implications for catchments. The type of urbanization we're experiencing is not in the formation of megacities, which we see in many first world countries, but rather more evenly spread between small towns and medium cities and larger cities. Post-urbanization, we see a significant engagement with the rural that persists through time. So people move to the city, they become fully urbanized, but they maintain linkages with rural environments, and that is a particular African condition. Particularly poor people in African cities continue to use the natural environment in those cities for livelihood and sustenance purposes. And something that I think we're all relatively familiar with, of course, particular to Africa and other parts of the world, but the very high slum populations in our cities. This figure here shows in dark orange the proportion of slum populations in our African cities. And I think sub-Saharan Africa, slum populations are around 62% of the area of our cities. And that figure will grow with our rapid urbanization. So what we're seeing is a dramatic population process that's going on right now on our continent, and it's thrilling, it's exciting, it's quite terrifying as well in some respects. And what interests me is, what does this mean for ecology? So what is urban ecology? What's it all about? Why should we bother? What makes it so cool? It's a relevant question because these cities actually only take up about 3% of the land surface of the earth. So you might think it's not particularly relevant. Ecology comes in two guises. There's ecology of the city, and then there's ecology in the city. Ecology of the city is it's that footprint notion. So we consume beyond our boundaries. We change landscapes to feed ourselves in the city. We're hungry beasts. And then we also spew out waste beyond our boundaries. And cities are significant drivers of change in that respect. And the notion of the ecology of the city is something to really sit up and take note of. Us urbanites on just 3% of the land are putting out 80% of the greenhouse gases. We're consuming 75% of the energy. We're consuming 78% of the world's wood resources. And of course, how this plays out is not in some neat sort of concentric circles around cities so you can see your guilty footprint. It plays out in very messy, non-linear relationships across the globe. So, and these are dictated by history and economics and politics, etc. The ecology in the city is is, again, you might say, what's the relevance, 3% of the land? But in how cities are managed and how they're arranged has significant implications for local aspects such as biodiversity, water resources, soil health, ecosystem service delivery within cities. And significantly, 50% and growing of our global population now lives in these cities. And this is the nature they will experience. So the ecology in cities is hugely socially important as well. So urban ecology is really the sort of fascinating dynamic between the socio-economic components playing out in the sort of biophysical space, and what emerges is a very distinct ecology. But it's a very dynamic ecology. These cities are growing all the time. In Africa, they're growing differently to how they're growing globally, and we don't yet fully understand that ecology, that urban ecology. And that is what makes it so particularly exciting. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about the ecology in the city of Cape Town. There's a real paucity of the ecology of the city of Cape Town. So if anyone's looking for a PhD, there's some work to be done there. Okay, so what's going on in our city? What's going on outside the door over there? I'm just going to, first of all, take a look at Cape Town as a purely ecological entity. We've covered some of this already. We're one of 26 biodiversity hotspots around the world in terms particularly of our plant biodiversity. Within our city boundaries, we have 3,350 plant species, which is phenomenal, indigenous plant species. Nationally, we've got 440 vegetation types. 19 of those occur in the city boundary of Cape Town, which is not that exciting. But the distressing news is that of those 440 national vegetation types, 21 are critically endangered, and 11 of those 21 are hosted in the city of Cape Town. So we are the proud owners of 52% of our critically endangered vegetation types in Cape Town. So before I talk about anything else, we just need to bear in mind that we have a significant conservation agenda in the city of Cape Town. And it has global implications. We have a global responsibility to this biodiversity. Nature in Cape Town has been variably revered and loathed through time. Initially revered particularly for its perennial fresh water supply by the sand hunter-gatherers, then by koi herders, and then by Dutch settlers. And this fresh water supply translated into fresh fruit and vegetables for passing ships, and at this point Cape Town almost took on sort of mythical proportions for desperate sailors who, there are horrific stories of people, scurvy-ridden sailors, clawing their way onto the deck. You can imagine them spitting out the odd tooth to catch a glimpse of Table Mountain as this place of solace and salvation. If you made it to Cape Town, you would probably live. And it took on, the natural environment of Cape Town took on these sort of, mythical proportions. But living in Cape Town was hard work 350 years ago, and the Dutch put a lot of effort and energy into cordoning off parts of the city and keeping nature at bay and ordering water into canals that could be managed and making gardens in rows. And really through time we've seen various people who've lived in and managed the city of Cape Town chipping away at these environmental challenges. And every city, the process of creating a city follows a trajectory of making benign or taming the environment. And through history we see endless stories of dealing with these environmental issues. The massive mobile sands of the Cape Flats were a huge environmental problem. People with herds of cattle could not pass over there unless they went on very clearly marked routes that were mapped out. There are crazy stories of early farmers of whole cabbages being ripped out of the ground by southeaster winds, which I don't find hard to imagine. I live in Woodstock. Horrific, loads and loads of stories of beasts, wild beasts. Jan van Riebeck in his diary writes an amazingly graphic description of a lion pushing the door open of a settler house and taking a dog from within the house. Can you imagine living with that sort of environmental ecology going on around you? It's very exciting, but a little bit too exciting. The British, of course, brought with them the emerging sense of nature and romance. And then really for the first time we see Table Mountain becoming this iconic backdrop to this beautiful city. But these varied views of friend and foe of nature in the city have persisted through time. And more recently, we've seen racially based social planning that have seen people sent out to live undoubtedly in the wilderness, in our hardest environmental areas on the Cape Flats. So what we're left with is a palimpsest, a single parchment that has been written on repeatedly through time. Multiple different cultural voices, different laws and policies to different ends of governance, personal stories of love and hardship, etc. And we've seen the city of Cape Town's nature carved, cut up, conserved, used variably through time. And we're left with this land legacy. Okay, I'm going to make 4, hopefully, relatively brief points. And with each point, I'm going to draw on a single piece of research that's emerged from within the city of Cape Town to illustrate that point. My first point is that we need a functioning ecology for conservation and ecosystem service delivery, but we still have information gaps on how biodiversity responds to the urban. And I'm going to just talk here briefly about the work from Poe and Kirsten, who looked at a nectar-feeding guild of birds, there are 4 species in this guild, and they looked at the presence of these birds from a remnant vegetation patch and then moving into the urban. So what you have on your y-axis is their sighting rate, and on your x-axis you've got distance from that vegetation type into the urban. Top left is the malachite sunbird. Then we've got the double-collared sunbird. Then the bottom two, the orange-breasted sunbird and the sugarbird, hugely sensitive to the urban environment and really just not present at all. This shows me 2 things. It says, firstly, in terms of fragmentation, these birds, these 4 species are responsible for the pollination of 320 plants. So any plant that's sitting on a smaller fragment, that's more than a kilometer away from a larger fragment, those plants are not being pollinated, which is very biologically important. It also says, secondly, what we have here is 1 guild, 4 species, 3 responses. We cannot generalize. We don't know what's going on. There are so many gaps like this in the literature, and there are people doing significant work, but we still don't know a lot. My second point is that we know the natural environment of Cape Town holds economic significance. We still need to work out how to give this traction with decision makers. Martin de Witt and co. Worked out a value, I think, within the city of Cape Town, the flow, the financial flow from the natural assets of Cape Town, and they put it at about, I think, 4 billion rand per annum. But I'm drawing here specifically on the work of Leif Peterson and colleagues who looked at more refined scale work at biodiversity harvesting and livelihoods in the city of Cape Town. And the figure here presented just shows the sites that they recorded where local biodiversity harvesting was collected from within the city boundary. And what they give us is an amazing inventory of 198 animal species and 250 plant species that are being collected within the city boundaries for sale in the informal economy that are supporting largely the poor communities of Cape Town. These are phenomenal figures, and no matter what you think about sustainability and access and poverty alleviation, the bottom line is that the natural environment in the city of Cape Town has huge economic value at various scales. Okay, my third point is that people are integral to forging socially and biologically meaningful landscapes. And I'm drawing here on the work of the master's student, Gina Avlanaitis, who looked at, she said her question was really, what's the ecological value to these social plantings that I'm seeing in society? So I see these groups of people planting indigenous plants, and what's the ecological return for us? And she worked particularly in Bottom Road Garden in Grassy Park and at Princess Lane Grassy Park. And then she took a bundle of ecological measures and compared these to some conservation areas. This graph just shows plant functional diversity. She did all sorts of other measures, but we know that functional diversity is important in terms of ecosystem service delivery, et cetera, and we can see these social plantings are heading towards the sort of functional diversity we would like to see in the natural system. And while these gardening endeavors will never be true conservation efforts, what we see here is a growth in the connectivity, the opportunity for pollinators to move through corridors of planted vegetation. We see a significant contribution in terms of ecosystem services. She looked at soil values, water infiltration, et cetera, and most significantly what we see is communities forging a green fabric in their own neighborhood that is indigenous, it's community-driven, and it's contributing to a sustainable ecological vision. My fourth point is that until we broker the gap between development and nature, neither is going to thrive. And I've just put up here a quote from Kumi Naidoo, who states, traditional Western-led environmentalism has failed to make the right connections between environmental, social, and economic justice. So until we bring these things together, until environment underpins things, we're not going to move forward in so many other aspects. And I'm drawing here on the work of Patrick O'Farrell and colleagues who used the very useful concept of ecosystem services and looked at the city of Cape Town through time. So basically what they did, they took, on the far left, you see the original vegetation of the city of Cape Town prior to any settlement. And then they looked at the current footprint, so what have we lost in terms of ecosystem service delivery, and then finally they looked at a future scenario. So if we have urban sprawl, what would be our even future, a sort of even worse case scenario of what ecosystem services we would lose in the city. And they found a myriad of things, but the one significant finding that they came up with is that while some ecosystem services can readily be outsourced, so we can get our water from over the mountain with relative ease, some ecosystem services have to be delivered in situ. And the cases that they presented, two examples were coastal zone protection and flood mitigation. And we know that these are both elements that are going to be exacerbated with future climate change scenarios. We also know that these are things that cannot be dealt with in terms of simple engineering solutions. So there are ecosystem service delivery imperatives within our city. There are things we need to protect that we cannot find and cannot get from any other place. So just to pause for a minute, to just think about what sort of emerged from the broad picture. In present-day Cape Town, what persists are these very variable views of the environment still today. And we have we have this understanding, we have a global responsibility to a conservation agenda, we have considerable development challenges and anthropogenic need. And mixed amongst all of that, we have people who like to walk dogs under pine trees, people who venerate our biodiversity, people who spend winters under corrugated iron with their feet in our water table, people who have wedding photos taken on Milton Beach. So these very variable responses to the environment, people who require the environment for cultural and religious purposes. And what we really need, what is imperative, is the development of a vision, a single vision for a sustainable and amenable environment that meets society and ecological needs within our city. So just to wrap up, I'll leave you with 3 points, really thinking around what kind of ecology do we want to forge for the city of Cape Town? What vision? What do we want? The first point I want to say is that where we live and the nature we experience will dictate our attitude to future environmental decisions. We know this. The scientific literature tells us this repeatedly. We know that 50% of our population is currently living in cities. That's going to grow. We govern our broader landscapes from within our cities. We grow our leaders in our cities. We need to develop an ecology, a green fabric in our cities that gives that message to people, so people understand the value and the importance of the environment. Cities are sites of innovation and creativity. The diversity of culture, of people, of practice in cities makes them very fertile places for solutions. And we need to take our environmental issues to society, to ourselves, to you out there. We need to own this situation. We need to put our heads together and think, how are we going to sort this out? Another nice thing about cities is that they're fantastic places for experimentation, and they make great laboratories. As socio-ecological entities, we're wonderfully self-aware, so we can implement things and critique them and can try things out. And it makes for an exciting sort of petri dish of opportunities within the city. And then my final question or challenge to you is that we have this huge opportunity ahead. We're currently sitting in Africa at 40% urban. We're headed to 60% urban, and we're doing it faster than anyone's ever done it before. So the question is, what are we going to make of this opportunity? How are we going to avoid a simple retrofit of what has been done in industrialized countries around the world in terms of city development and growth, which frankly hasn't worked? It's not sustainable. How are we going to embrace the African and spin something that is new and sustainable, where nature is the absolute bottom line?